There are places in history where everything just works, where the rhythm of daily life becomes so predictable that people forget it was ever designed, where complexity hides beneath simplicity, where 1,000 moving parts align so perfectly that no one notices them moving at all. This was one of those places. The morning began the same way it had for decades. Trucks arrived before dawn, their cargo already sorted, already counted, already assigned to shelves that expected them. Drivers knew their routes by heart. Warehouse workers moved with the efficiency of choreography. The system didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed, like gravity. In the city center, offices filled at precisely the same hour each day. Typewriters clattered, telephones rang. Papers moved from desk to desk in predictable patterns. Everyone knew their role. No one questioned it. The grocery stores opened with shelves fully stocked. Milk, bread, meat, vegetables arranged in neat rows. Customers walked the aisles with shopping lists that never changed much week to week. Why would they? Everything was always there. Children walked to school along the same paths their parents had walked. Teachers taught from textbooks that had been updated. Yes, but never reimagined. The curriculum prepared students for roles that already existed, in a world that seemed fixed. Factories operated in 3 shifts. The night workers clocked in as the evening workers clocked out. Production quotas were met. Materials arrived on schedule. Finished goods departed on schedule. The system fed itself. Power flowed through the grid without interruption. Water ran through pipes without hesitation. Waste disappeared on collection day. Infrastructure worked so reliably that it became invisible. People complained sometimes, of course, about small things. The quality of bread, the wait at the post office, the predictability of it all. But these were the complaints of comfort, the complaints of people who had forgotten what genuine scarcity felt like. Because the truth is, the system had solved problems that previous generations thought unsolvable. There had been hunger once, real hunger, the kind that hollowed out entire families. But the distribution network had ended that. Centralized planning meant food reached even the remotest villages. It wasn't perfect, but it was reliable. There had been chaos once, competing interests, power struggles, uncertainty about tomorrow. But the system had ended that too. Everyone had a place. Everyone had a function. The anxiety of choice had been replaced by the comfort of certainty. And for a long time, that comfort was enough. The architects of the system were proud. They had built something that ran like clockwork. They had created predictability in an unpredictable world. They pointed to the statistics, production numbers, distribution efficiency, employment rates, and the numbers told a story of triumph. But systems are not machines. Machines can run forever if maintained. Systems depend on something more fragile. They depend on belief. And already, quietly, that belief was beginning to crack. It started in places no one was watching. A shipping clerk noticed that certain forms were taking longer to process. Nothing dramatic. A few extra days here and there. He mentioned it once, was told it was temporary, and stopped mentioning it. A factory supervisor saw that replacement parts for aging equipment were arriving later than usual. He improvised. He found workarounds. He kept production moving. No one above him ever knew there was a problem. A farmer delivered grain to a regional depot and was told storage was full. Come back next week. He did. Storage was still full. He left the grain by the roadside and drove home. These were not disasters. These were whispers. But in a system designed for perfect flow, whispers accumulate. The people at the top saw only aggregate data, totals, averages, projections. Everything looked normal because the system was designed to make everything look normal. Deviations were smoothed out. Anomalies were dismissed. The report said everything was fine, and perhaps it was, for now. The human mind is built to notice patterns, but it is also built to ignore them when they threaten comfort. By the midpoint of the decade, the whispers had become murmurs. Store shelves were still full, but certain items appeared less frequently. A particular brand of canned vegetables, a type of soap, light bulbs. People shrugged. They bought alternatives. The system still provided. Just differently. Delivery trucks still arrived, but schedules drifted. A shipment expected on Tuesday might arrive on Thursday. Managers adjusted. Workers compensated. No formal complaints were filed because no formal failures had occurred. The train still ran, but maintenance windows grew longer. Routes were quietly consolidated. Passengers noticed longer waits, but the train still came. Eventually, in the factories, workers began to notice something odd. The machinery was older than it used to be. Equipment that should have been replaced years ago was still in service, patched and repatched. Production quotas remained the same, but meeting them required longer hours, more overtime, more improvisation. One worker asked his supervisor when new equipment would arrive. "Soon," the supervisor said. Months passed. "Soon," he said again. The question stopped being asked. In the rural areas, the changes were more visible. Fertilizer shipments arrived late, sometimes not at all. Farmers planted anyway, using smaller amounts, stretching what they had. Yields dropped slightly, not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to matter. Irrigation systems broke down and repair crews took weeks to arrive instead of days. Fields went unwatered, crops withered at the edges. Farmers compensated by planting less, focusing only on what they could reliably manage. The system recorded the harvests. The numbers went into reports. The reports said production was within acceptable ranges. And it was, technically, but acceptable is not the same as abundant. In the cities, people began to notice something else. The variety was shrinking. Grocery stores still had food, but the choices were fewer. 5 types of bread became 3. 10 types of cheese became 4. Imported goods appeared less often, then stopped appearing at all. People adjusted. Humans always adjust. They changed their shopping habits. They bought what was available instead of what they wanted. They told themselves it didn't matter. Bread is bread. But scarcity is a slow teacher. It doesn't announce itself with sirens. It arrives quietly, in the form of empty hooks where products used to hang. In the form of handwritten signs saying, "temporarily out of stock." In the form of cashiers who stop apologizing because they've said, "We don't have that anymore," too many times. The system's administrators noticed the changes, of course. They held meetings. They reviewed reports. They identified inefficiencies and proposed solutions. Committees were formed. Analyses were conducted. Recommendations were drafted. But implementation required resources. And resources required prioritization. And prioritization required consensus. And consensus required time. Time the system no longer had. Because while the administrators debated, the pressure kept building. Truck drivers began to quit. The pay was the same, but fuel was harder to get, routes were longer, and the trucks themselves were breaking down more often. Why drive for 12 hours when you could work locally for nearly the same wage? The distribution network began to thin. Factory workers began to leave. Overtime was constant now. Equipment failures were routine, and the promised upgrades never came. Younger workers found jobs elsewhere. Older workers retired early. The production network began to weaken. Farmers began to reduce their planting. If the system couldn't guarantee fertilizer, couldn't guarantee repairs, couldn't guarantee that their harvest would be collected on time, why plant more than they needed for themselves? The supply network began to shrink. And still, the report said everything was fine. Because the system measured what it had always measured. It measured output. It measured distribution. It measured employment. It did not measure trust. It did not measure resilience. It did not measure the growing certainty, spreading quietly through the population, that the system was no longer reliable. And trust, once lost, does not return with a memo. Collapse is not an event. It is a cascade. It began on a Tuesday in autumn. A refinery in the southern region experienced a mechanical failure. Not unusual. Repairs were scheduled, but the replacement part was back-ordered. The refinery reduced output. Fuel shipments to the northern distribution hubs were delayed by 3 days. 3 days. Truck drivers in the north waited. Some deliveries were postponed. Warehouses adjusted their schedules. It was manageable. But then a second refinery, in the eastern region, went offline for scheduled maintenance. The maintenance took longer than expected because the repair crew was short-staffed. Their colleagues had quit the month before. Fuel shipments were delayed by another 4 days. Now the northern warehouses had a problem. Deliveries that should have arrived weren't arriving. Stores that depended on regular shipments were running low. Managers called the distribution centers. The distribution centers called the regional offices. The regional offices called headquarters. Headquarters reviewed the numbers. Temporary disruption, the report said. Fuel production will normalize within the week. But the warehouses couldn't wait a week. They started rationing. Stores received smaller shipments. Shelves began to empty. Customers noticed immediately. Bread sections, usually overflowing, had gaps. Meat counters, usually full, displayed only a few cuts. Produce, which had always been abundant, was suddenly sparse. People did what people always do when scarcity appears. They bought more. Not because they needed more, because they feared there wouldn't be more later. Shelves that had been half empty in the morning were completely empty by noon. Store managers called the warehouses. We need emergency resupply. The warehouses called the distribution centers. We need emergency authorization. The distribution centers called headquarters. We need emergency fuel allocation. Headquarters reviewed the request. Denied. Fuel reserves are designated for essential services. Food distribution is an essential service, not according to the priority list. Click. The next day, the shelves were emptier. The day after that, some stores didn't open at all. The panic that had been creeping through the population now broke into a run. Lines formed outside grocery stores before dawn, hundreds of people waiting in silence, hoping there would be something left when the doors opened. Sometimes there was, sometimes there wasn't. Fights broke out, not many. Not. Just enough to make people scared. The government issued a statement. Temporary supply disruptions. Remain calm. Do not hoard. The system is resilient. But the system was not resilient. The fuel shortage rippled outward. Trucks couldn't run without fuel. Factories couldn't operate without trucks bringing materials. Farms couldn't harvest without fuel for tractors. Power plants couldn't generate electricity without fuel for turbines. One failure fed another. Within 2 weeks, electricity became intermittent. Rolling blackouts swept through the cities. 4 hours on, 4 hours off. People lit candles. Refrigerators stopped working. Food that families had stockpiled began to spoil. Water treatment plants, dependent on electricity, reduced operations. Tap water became unreliable. People boiled what they could. Those without fuel to boil went thirsty. The factories shut down, not by choice, by necessity. No materials, no power, no workers willing to show up when transportation had collapsed. Production stopped. The trains stopped running. The stations fell silent. Platforms that had been crowded with commuters every morning stood empty. The tracks gathered rust. The system, which had moved millions of tons of goods and millions of people every single day for decades, simply stopped. And in the silence, people realized something terrible. They had forgotten how to live without it. There was no local food network. Farms had been consolidated into industrial operations miles from the cities. There were no backyard gardens, no preserved food, no stockpiles. There were no local repair networks. Everything had been centralized. If your water pipe broke, you called the state service. But the state service wasn't answering anymore. There was no informal economy. Everything had run through official channels for so long that people had lost the habits of barter, of trade, of self-reliance. The system had worked so well that it had made itself indispensable, and now it was gone. When structure collapses, humans do not become chaos. They become desperately creative. In the first days after the collapse, people waited. Surely the government would fix this. Surely the trucks would start running again. Surely this was temporary. They waited in their apartments. They rationed what food they had. They told their children everything would be fine soon. But soon didn't come. After a week, people stopped waiting and started acting. Some left the cities. They packed what they could carry and walked toward the rural areas, hoping to find food, hoping to find work, hoping to find anything. Roads filled with refugees fleeing a disaster that had no fire. No invading army, no visible enemy, just absence. Those who stayed in the cities began to organize. Neighborhood groups formed. People pooled resources. If one family had flour and another had oil, they shared. If someone knew how to fix a generator, they became invaluable. Black markets appeared overnight. Goods that had been distributed freely by the system were now sold in alleyways, in basements, in parks after dark. A can of meat for a week's wages, a bag of rice for a wedding ring. The prices were absurd, but people paid them. Because the alternative was starvation. Others turned inward. Families barricaded their doors. They trusted no one. They hoarded what little they had and waited, silent and terrified, for the chaos to pass. Some people tried to restore the system. Engineers showed up at power plants and tried to restart the generators. Workers arrived at distribution centers and tried to organize shipments. Volunteers attempted to coordinate food deliveries. But a system is not a collection of parts. It is a web of dependencies. The power plant needed fuel. The fuel depot needed electricity. The electricity grid needed maintenance crews. The maintenance crews needed transportation. The transportation network needed centralized coordination. And the centralized coordination was gone. Without the whole, the parts were useless. Violence, when it came, was not organized. There were no riots, no revolutions, just scattered, desperate acts. A man broke into a warehouse and was shot by a guard who had been told to protect the inventory. The guard went home that night and cried. A group of mothers stormed a government office demanding food for their children. The officials inside had none to give. The mothers left, defeated, and one of them never came home. There were no heroes in this collapse, only people trying to survive. But survival requires hope, and hope requires a belief that tomorrow will be different from today. For many, that belief was gone. Elderly people, unable to forage or fight for resources, simply stopped eating. They sat in their homes, waiting quietly for the end. Children grew thin. Their parents made impossible choices. Feed everyone a little and risk everyone starving. Feed the youngest and let the oldest go without. The system had eliminated these choices for decades. Now they were back. And the people who faced them had no practice, no precedent, no memory of how to endure. Months passed. The cities emptied slowly. Buildings stood silent. Streets, once filled with traffic and noise, echoed only with wind. The society that had seemed so permanent, so unshakable, had evaporated like morning fog, not destroyed, just gone. Recovery is not a return, it is a rebuilding. And what gets built is never quite the same. After the collapse, those who survived found themselves in a world that looked familiar but felt alien. The buildings were still there. The roads were still there. The infrastructure, rusting and silent, was still there. But the connections were gone. Slowly, painfully, people began to reconstruct life. Not the old life. That was impossible. The system that had sustained them required resources, coordination, and trust that no longer existed. They built something smaller. Villages reformed around local resources. A town near a river had water. A settlement near farmland had food. People moved to where survival was possible and stayed there. The centralized networks dissolved into a patchwork of isolated communities. Trade resumed, but it was primitive. No trains, no trucks. Just people walking, carrying goods on their backs, bartering directly. A bag of grain for a piece of cloth, a tool for a week's labor. The economy shrank to match the new reality. Power returned in some places. Small generators, locally maintained grids, a few hours of electricity each evening, enough to power a light bulb, enough to feel human. Some cities tried to rebuild the system. Committees formed, plans were drafted, volunteers were organized. But without the resources, without the fuel, without the infrastructure, the plans remained plans. You cannot rebuild a cathedral with bricks alone. The psychological scars ran deeper than the material ones. An entire generation had grown up believing the system would always provide. That belief had been shattered. They taught their children differently now. They taught them to save, to stockpile, to distrust promises. They taught them that systems fail, and while that lesson made them resilient, It also made them fearful. Communities that had once been open became closed. Strangers were viewed with suspicion. Resources were guarded jealously. The collapse had not only destroyed the system, it had destroyed the trust that allowed systems to exist in the first place. Some people tried to explain what had happened. They wrote books. They gave speeches. They pointed to the warning signs that had been ignored. The delayed shipments, the aging equipment, the shrinking variety, the dependence on a structure too complex to fail gracefully. But explanations don't undo suffering. And for most people, the question wasn't, why did it happen? It was, how do we make sure it never happens again? The answer, it turned out, was contradictory. Some communities embraced decentralization. They made themselves small, local, self-sufficient. They rejected complexity in favor of simplicity. Others tried to rebuild the system, but better, with redundancies, with backups, with local autonomy nested inside a larger framework. Neither approach was perfect. Decentralization meant security, but it also meant poverty. Communities that relied only on themselves remained small, weak, vulnerable. Centralization meant efficiency, but it also meant risk. Any new system, no matter how carefully designed, carried the same fundamental flaw. It could fail. Decades later, the cities began to fill again. Younger generations, who had no memory of the collapse, returned to the buildings their parents had abandoned. They saw potential. They saw opportunity. They rebuilt. But the older generation watched with a mixture of hope and dread. Because they knew something the young did not. Systems that work perfectly are the most dangerous. Because people stop questioning them. And when they stop questioning, they stop noticing the cracks. There is a city now, thriving and bright. Its streets are filled with people. Its markets overflow with goods. Its infrastructure hums with efficiency. The trains run on time. The lights never flicker. The supply chains move seamlessly from farm to factory to table. It is a beautiful system, and it works perfectly. Children ride to school on electric buses. Workers commute on high-speed rails. Families shop in stores, stocked with thousands of products from around the world. No one goes hungry. No one fears scarcity. The system provides. In the government offices, planners monitor screens filled with data. Production rates, distribution flows, efficiency metrics. Everything is optimized. Everything is tracked. The numbers say the system is resilient. Redundancies have been built in. Backups exist for backups. Lessons have been learned. This system, they say, is different. This system cannot fail. And perhaps they are right. Or perhaps they are simply the latest generation to believe that complexity can be controlled, that efficiency is the same as resilience, that a system working perfectly today will work perfectly tomorrow. Perhaps they have forgotten that systems do not fail all at once. They weaken quietly. Pressure builds in places no one monitors anymore. Small disruptions are dismissed as temporary. Adjustments are delayed. Warnings become background noise. And by the time anyone notices, it is already too late. In a small museum on the outskirts of the city, there is an exhibit. It shows photographs of the old system, the empty streets, the silent factories, the shelves stripped bare. Visitors walk through slowly, reading the plaques, shaking their heads. How could they let this happen? They whisper. They do not notice the similarities. They do not see the patterns repeating. They leave the museum and board the train home, trusting completely that it will arrive on time, because it always has. So far,